Alright guys, it's Dr. Muhammad. We are back with yet another public health sciences question. I'm going to give you guys about 15 seconds to read this one. Feel free to pause the video if you need some more time, and then we'll go through it. So in this case, the correct answer was choice A, proceed with emergent blood transfusion. This one was a little bit tricky. Hopefully you got it right, but let's break it down. You are the physician working in a busy emergency department when a nurse calls you to see a patient they are concerned about. A 14-year-old female with no past medical history presents due to lethargy. Her mother states the patient has been very sleepy for the past several days, however she appears even more sleepy today. The patient's mother also mentions that the patient is currently on her menstrual period and has been changing her pads every hour, so it sounds like pretty heavy menstrual bleeding. Blood work is obtained and you find that the patient has a critically low hemoglobin, so this patient is severely anemic. You explain to the mother that you believe the patient requires a blood transfusion, however the mother refuses, citing that this is against their religious beliefs. While in the room, the patient's blood pressure begins to drop rapidly. What is the most appropriate next step in management? You probably knew that this one was coming, right? This is a huge topic. This is something that we absolutely need to know for the exam, so I wanted to make sure that you guys got tested on it. So taking the 10,000 foot view of this question, we have a 14-year-old female, no past medical history. She's currently on her menstrual period, and it sounds like she's been having some pretty heavy menstrual bleeding. Her hemoglobin's low. We want to give her a blood transfusion. However, her mother is refusing that because of religious beliefs, and the patient is getting even worse and worse. Her blood pressure is dropping right in front of our eyes. So this is becoming a very critical situation. So what are we going to do? Based on all that information, we know we're in public health sciences. We know we're talking about things like decision-making capacity and consent, and more specifically than that, because this patient is less than 18, she's 14 years old, we're talking about consent for minors. Remember, a minor is any person that is below 18 years old, and if we are doing any type of procedure, even if it's something like a laceration repair, we are going to need parental consent. That being said, there are some exceptions to this rule, and it was high yield during the lecture, so hopefully you were paying attention, but we'll go through it again just in case you weren't. So there were 4 big exceptions when it came to consent for minors, and the first one was that the patient is emancipated. Remember, this is something like a minor who is married and is living outside of their parents' home on their own. They are in the military, they are self-supporting, they have an income, and they are able to take care of themselves. If they have anything like that, they are legally emancipated, and you do not need to get parental consent for any type of procedure, or in this case for something like a blood transfusion. The other 3 exceptions to getting parental consent for minors, we kind of grouped together with the mnemonic sex, drugs, rock and roll, so hopefully you remember that. The sex part was things like contraceptions, pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections. We do not need to get parental consent to test or treat for those. The drugs was anything having to do with substance use, whether that's alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, other illicit substances. We do not need to get consent to stabilize or manage patients for those issues. And then finally, it was rock and roll, and that is anything that's an emergent procedure. The patient is critically ill. Included in that is something like a blood transfusion. And hopefully your memory is doing you well, because blood transfusion was the example for that on the slide, and it was also high yield. So now that we are armed with that information and you guys got a gentle reminder, let's go through all of the answer choices. Choice B, urge the mother to reconsider her decision. This is something that is reasonable, right? The mother is refusing a blood transfusion because of religious purposes. She maybe doesn't understand the consequences of this decision, so ideally we should try to discuss this a little bit more and explain it. However, in this case, the patient is getting sicker. Their blood pressure is dropping in front of our eyes. We do not have time for this. It is becoming an emergent situation. So because of the fact that the patient is getting sicker and sicker, unfortunately, it is an emergent situation. We do not have time to discuss things further with the mother. That is why choice B is not the correct answer. Choice C, attempt to obtain consent from the patient's father instead. This is tricky for a lot of different reasons. First of all, again, this is a critically ill patient. Her blood pressure is dropping. She is severely anemic. We do not have time to go track down the father or call them on the phone, that kind of thing, because the patient could end up getting even sicker than they already are. In addition to that, ideally you would want to get both of the family members or both of the parents or whoever it is in the room and have a discussion about this kind of thing if the patient is stable and if you have time. You don't want to go behind the mother's back and try to get consent from the father, and then that would be a whole issue between those 2 parents. So for multiple reasons, choice C is also not the correct answer. Choice D, withhold blood transfusions as per the mother's wishes. This is definitely not the right answer. The patient is critically ill, their blood pressure is dropping. If we don't do something about this in this moment, they could end up going into cardiac arrest and they could end up dying, which would be a far worse scenario. So although you do want to respect the patient's autonomy and the parents and their wishes, again, because this is an emergent situation, we definitely would not want to withhold a blood transfusion. We do want to do that because it may be life-saving for the patient, and that is why choice D is not the correct answer. And finally here, choice E, consult the ethics committee. This is your trap. Whenever you have public health sciences or ethics questions on the exam, this answer choice, consulting the ethics committee, is going to be there. And we discussed this in a previous video as well, but whenever you see consult the ethics committee, it's probably not the correct answer. The only scenario in where it may be the correct answer is when you've done every single other thing possible that you can think of and you haven't come to a solution. So in this case, if the patient was more stable and their blood pressure wasn't dropping, and we spoke to the mom and we spoke to the dad and we had a family meeting and we got social services involved and we got case management involved, all of these different things, and we still didn't have a solution and we felt that the patient needed a blood transfusion, then at the very end of that algorithm, we would want to consult the ethics committee. However, again, and I know I'm belaboring the point, but I really want to make sure that you guys understand this sentence right here, while in the room, the patient's blood pressure begins to drop rapidly. It's not just dropping, it's dropping rapidly. This is the question telling you this is an emergent situation, and if you do not act, this patient is going to die. So you do not have time to consult the ethics committee. That is not the appropriate choice in this scenario, and that is why choice E is not correct. And that leaves us with choice A, proceed with emergent blood transfusion. We've already said this is the correct answer. This is that rock and roll portion of the exceptions for getting parental consent for minors. It's an emergency situation. The patient is near imminent death potentially. So we are going to bypass the parents' wishes despite their religious beliefs, and we are going to give the life-saving treatment for this patient. This one may have been a little bit trickier. If you had a hard time with it, I definitely recommend going back to the public health sciences lecture and taking a look at the capacity and consent portion of that, but hopefully you got it right, and I'll see you in the next one.